you. When I was asked to do this lecture today, I wasn't entirely sure why, and I sort of thought, well, maybe it's based on frequency of visits to the library, maybe that's it. Because there was a point in time when, and this was back some time ago, when the library staff actually was in the basement, and it's the area, the PhD study area now, and I walked in and two staff members were there and they were talking, and when I walked in they started to laugh, and it was that sort of like, she's back, kind of feeling when I came in. So I want to make this time a time when I tell you about what drives my research, more than the technicalities of doing it. I mean, how do I certainly use libraries in working on my publications, but I think the story that I want to share with you today is what leads up to the publications. And that's important because I normally talk about what I'm finding and what I'm publishing rather than how I got to it. And so that's what I want to share with you today, how I got to what I do publish. And just let me say, though, in honor of Theological Libraries Month, that I love libraries. Whenever there's an introduction where my mother is present and they talk about my multiple degrees and all of that, my mother always says, she just likes school. But when I think about it, what I really liked were libraries. And as I was thinking about what I would say today, I realized I can still remember the library that I went to in elementary school. It was a public library. And I still remember the feeling of going into that library. And in secondary school, I remember that library being a place that I loved. And in university, there was a particular comfortable chair that I liked sort of sinking into with my reading for the classes. So I think I need to inform my mother that it's really that I loved libraries, and so that was the secret to my continuing to stay on in school. I also want to acknowledge the support that I've gotten from the library staff during my now entering 17 years here at Garrett-Evangelical, and especially Kathleen Cordish, who's no longer here, but she and all of the staff members have just been so gracious to me. And I remember one time when I needed to get an article or a chapter done over the Christmas break, and I had forgotten that the library would be closed over Christmas break. And so with the help of Krista McNeil and a student at the time, in 2 days, as well as the library staff, within 2 days, they got 75 books for me that were all piled up in my office so that I had access to everything I needed during that holiday season. And I remember that there were times when I'd kind of feel overwhelmed that I had so many deadlines kind of coming up at the same time. And I would remember how much help I had gotten from the library staff, and it was like, you have no excuse not to get this article done. I mean, they have done all of this to pull these resources together for you. Get the article done, So thank you for all of that the library has done. In a word, my research is driven by passion. Unlike many biblical scholars who only focus on the past, on ancient Israel in my case, I do very little of that. I really work on how the Bible is being interpreted today. And basically what my agenda is to counter harmful ways that biblical texts are being used. And it started out when I was in graduate school, where I wanted to, at that point, I was transitioning from practicing law. I practiced law for 10 years in Washington, D.C. So I was transitioning from being a lawyer to becoming a biblical scholar in the 7 years that I was in a PhD program. And the way to do that was to work on biblical laws because they were familiar. I knew something about legal theory, and so it was an easy transition. But what I wanted to look at involved gender. And I was really concerned about the way gender is constructed in laws in such a way that men commit violence on women and women accept the violence, that there's a way in which that happens. And I could construct, using critical theory, a way that the laws actually create that. And we think, oh, nobody reads those biblical laws. But yes, they do have an impact that affects us today. So that, in fact, was later on rewritten and became the first book, Women, Ideology, and Violence. You can tell it's a reworked dissertation, but I actually have a problem with titles. I realize that my titles are never catchy, so I need to work on that. But Women, Ideology, and Violence, Critical Theory, and the Construction of Gender in two of the major law codes, the ones in Exodus and Deuteronomy, not Leviticus. Leviticus has the third major law code, and I didn't work on those. But I didn't quite get to the point I wanted to get to in that. I could connect violence in terms of subordination of women, but I really wanted to connect it with violence as interpretation. That biblical interpretations can, in fact, constitute a form of violence. And I'm very proud to say that an article that was just published earlier this year, I actually got to do that. And I used the theory of a medical doctor, strangely enough. And I think that's also one of the facets that contributes to my research, and that is I'm very interdisciplinary. Paul Farmer, I came across his name in my work on HIV. He's based primarily in Haiti, but his theory is that when you see disease prevalence, you need to look at what's causing that disease prevalence, and especially in impoverished areas. And he calls the kinds of inequities that create an increased rate of disease systemic violence. And then starting with that premise, I was able to take a look at, it was peace theory. And it's like, but again, it was just using library resources to do some research on who was working with Paul Farmer's ideas. And I came across a theory about how religious doctrines and policies, in fact, contribute to systemic violence. So I was able to make a connection between biblical interpretations that support the subordination of women, the condemnation of homosexuality, to the high HIV prevalence rates. So I finally got to do something, and I realized it took me 20 years to make that argument. But that article is in this edited volume that came out earlier this year. So since the early time when I did my doctoral research in that first book, HIV has been the all-consuming passion for me. And so my work primarily has actually been workshops and lectures given at conferences. In fact, I was just in Los Angeles over the weekend to give a lecture and then a Bible study, but related to issues of inclusion. But I always work in HIV because HIV is sort of the result of a lot of discriminatory practices. That's basically how that works. So how did I start my work on HIV? Because people often ask me that, like, how are you, a faculty member? Aren't you supposed to just stay in the ivory tower? How did you end up doing this work with HIV? And it started out in 2002. I actually grew up for a large part of my childhood in Africa. And so as a biblical scholar, I knew biblical scholars and theologians who were women and who were African. And in 2002, a group called the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians and that theologians is defined broadly, so it includes biblical scholars as well, were having a conference in Ethiopia. And I knew women who were going, and they said, Cheryl, you can come, but you need to write a paper about your context. So I thought, okay, I'll do something on women and girls and African American women, primarily here in the United States. And this was 2002. And I was shocked by the high rates of HIV infections in the African American community, and just appalled that there was no public discussion about it at that time. And in fact, just this morning, I thought I would look at the Centers for Disease Control website to get some current statistics. And what I want to emphasize is that the statistics basically are better, but they're still high, and they were even higher in 2002. And it was like, why is this not a matter of public discussion? So there are about 55,000 people who were infected with HIV each year, and we know that almost half of them are African American, which is a disproportionate amount, seeing as how we're only 13% of the population. So there's that great disparity right there. A significant proportion of them are men who have sex with men. And the rates for women were incredibly high, but between 2005 and 2014, the diagnoses for African American women fell by about 42%, but they're still high compared to other women of other ethnicities. But what was really shocking when I looked at these statistics this morning is when you look at ongoing care, because the thing about HIV is that there are medications now which make it a chronic disease, just as diabetes or hypertension, but the problem is access to medical treatment. And from all global agencies, the emphasis now is what's called 90-90-90, getting 90% of people at risk tested, get 90% on medications, and get the viral suppression down so that it's only like 90%. It's virally suppressed, which means when that happens is that the likelihood of a person who is HIV positive infecting another person becomes almost negligible. So that 90-90-90 is what the goal is. But of the African Americans diagnosed with HIV in 2013, about 80% were linked to HIV medical care within 3 months, but only 51% were retained in HIV care. So there's a great drop-off, and that's not good, because your reactions to the drugs change over time, so you have to be under constant care. In fact, you even need to take your medication at the same time every day to keep the viral suppression effective. And then only 37% of African Americans living with HIV were prescribed antiretroviral therapy. So I mean, again, just like these great discrepancies. And then the death rates for African Americans are very high. And again, it's not necessary because the drugs do work. But it is an indication of the lack of access to medical care. And then also stigma, people not wanting to get tested, not stay on treatment. And so that's an ongoing problem. But since I've been doing this work then since 2002, what have I done? So the first stage of research was when I wanted to look at African American churches that had model AIDS ministries. And I went to churches in Wilmington, Delaware, Oakland, California, Nashville, Tennessee, here in Chicago, Trinity UCC, and then Covenant Baptist UCC in Washington, D.C. And what I wanted to find is what were the biblical resources that they used for these model HIV ministries. Now, how did I define a model HIV ministry? Well, I had one criteria, and that is that they had to be open and affirming, because you can't condemn homosexuality from the pulpit and then say, y'all come get tested. It's just not going to work. In fact, what I also found is that for most churches, even if they offered testing, their own people wouldn't go there for testing, which tells you something about how people are a little bit suspicious about their brothers and sisters in Christ, that they won't get tested in their own churches. They'll go someplace else. But what I wanted to find is, were there biblical resources they were using? And unfortunately, what I found is that they weren't using biblically based resources for those AIDS ministries, so that I would be impressed by the inclusiveness and the progressive kind of theological bend that I would see in the HIV ministry. And then for each church, I would make sure that I went to a Sunday school class, an adult Sunday school class, on a Sunday. And I was surprised at how conservative those resources were. And they were not making any connections to their context. For instance, there was one that I went to, this was Wilmington, Delaware, and they were using some fundamentalist kind of study. And the text for the day, the biblical passage for the day, was the Annunciation. So Mary finding out that she's going to be pregnant. And I mean, and this is a community where teenage pregnancy rates are high. I mean, all of these dramas, you know, low infant birth rate, increasing maternal death in childbirth, and none of those issues were brought to bear when they were looking at this text. It was just, you know, this is the text, and it was like, yeah, but look outside your windows. You're seeing all of this stuff going on. How could you not relate it to your own lives when you see this? So I was just really shocked by that. The other church where there's a sort of standout memory was Oakland, because Oakland, well, actually it was San Francisco, and it was both Glide Memorial United Methodist Church and then also Bishop Yvette Flinders City of Refuge Church. And that, for both of those ministries, I was introduced to transgender persons, and I had never really encountered transgender persons here. And I knew the statistics of violence against transgender people. So, and I know what they are for Black women, and I didn't think anybody had worse statistics than we did, you know. So, so to meet transgender people, as when I did in the San Francisco Bay Area, I felt very protective. And there was one incident where a person was walking me from, a transgender person was walking me from Glide Memorial to City of Refuge. You can't do that now because City of Refuge has since moved, and they're on the other side of the bay in Oakland. But I just was afraid that something would happen. And you know that expression, you attract what you fear? So sure enough, someone stopped us. And it was a crazy kind of request. He was on foot, but he was asking how to drive to LA. And it just, all kinds of alarms went off. And so when he said something to me, I said, I'm a tourist. He lives here. And the person said, that's a she. And I realized what I had done. I was just so panicked. It was just that fear of violence that was just so strong. And then when I talked to her afterwards about it, I said, I am so sorry. I said, I didn't mean that, but I was just anxious because, I was just anxious. And her response was, I know you didn't say that to hurt me. And I just thought, wow, what is that like to live your life where you know that just the pronoun that someone uses is a sign of disdain and rejection. So I was learning as I was doing this research. I was being exposed, and my own boundaries were certainly being expanded. The next stage was I started going to South Africa, because when I thought, okay, how do you write Bible studies that will meet the need? How do you teach theology? How do you teach Bible in the context of HIV and AIDS? I wanted to go to South Africa because they have the highest number of persons in the world living with HIV. And so I was posted at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Pietermaritzburg. It's about an hour away from Durban. And then in later years, this was between 2008 and 2012, a Methodist seminary, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, started their seminary, or actually moved their seminary to Pietermaritzburg across the street from UKZN. And what I found during that 5-year period is that the guidelines for HIV prevention that were part of the US funded program didn't work. It was the ABC program, abstain until you get married, be faithful if married, and then if all else fails, C, use a condom. Well, what quickly happens is that the condom use doesn't really get translated widely, and the problem is that people by and large don't abstain until they get married to have sex. South Africa, here is a country with high birth rates to women who aren't married. And so it doesn't work as a prevention method. That's the thing that I couldn't quite understand. And what happened under the Bush administration, there were people like Franklin Graham who were very, very active in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was you had to agree to that approach in order to get US funds. So it didn't work. It was frustrating for the people who were actually activists and doing this work. And I knew that I had to come up with a different way to see what the Christian response should be. I had to develop that because I knew, along with my colleagues there, because I knew it didn't exist. And what was surprising is that no matter how high the statistics got, what the church has said never changed. So where I was in South Africa had the highest rates in South Africa, and as it was estimated that as many as, I think it was something like a third of the adult population was HIV positive. And they would still say the same nonsense about prevention. So the advantage of my being there, besides meeting some really wonderful people, is that I got to learn how to do contextual Bible study. And that has been a large part of what I've continued to do and the kinds of workshops that I lead across the US now. For instance, it wasn't long after that I started as a participant in a Centers for Disease Control funded project where we did workshops with African American church leaders across the country. And we were in Rochester, New York, Oakland, California, Houston, Columbia, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. And I did a study, I think Jim Forbes did one of them. The pastor signed up to come once a month to a workshop, a learning workshop, for about 6 months. So there were 6 featured speakers, and I came in about the middle. In fact, one of the things that was really sort of scary about that is that attendance would drop when it was the Bible. And I never quite figured out why. Was it that they feared that the Bible would reinforce what they believed, or that it would challenge what they believed? I mean, I never quite figured that out, but we saw that in city after city that the numbers would drop when I came to do my contextual Bible study. And I also, as part of that workshop, taught them how to do it so that they could continue to do it. And the advantage of contextual Bible study is that it allows you to connect the text with what's going on in the streets outside the doors of the church. It really brings it around to your own particular context. So at this point, clearly what was needed was some kind of consistent, coherent argument that removed the violence of current interpretations, all of these interpretations concerning women, LGBTQ community, that increased vulnerability. That's basically what it was. And so I wanted to do a book on that, but somehow I get caught up in workshops and things and didn't get it done. And one of the motivating factors over the time that I was supposed to write it, because I had a book contract and I just couldn't get this book written, was that, but even throughout that, I didn't want to give up the project. In fact, someone had said, Cheryl, just give them back the advance and be done with it. But I didn't want to give up because there were 3 reviewers that the publisher had contacted, and they had reviewed my book proposal. And 2 of them had said, it's a good book proposal, it's a book that needs to be written, we know her background, and we think that, you know, she'll get this done. One reviewer, though, said, it's a good proposal, but she's not the one to write it. And I never knew who it was who said that, but this person was big enough in my field that they said that they needed to send it to another reviewer to break the tie. Well, what tie? It was 2 against 1, you know? I didn't quite get that. But over the years, even though I couldn't quite get to write that book, I just thought, I do not want to prove that right, you know, that I wasn't, you know, it was like, I'm going to get that book written. So in 2009, this book came out, and it did, in a way, it answered the question that I had. Can I, as a biblical scholar, sustain an argument for interpreting the Bible differently? And so I did do that. But what actually finally got me to do it wasn't just to see if I could construct that argument. It was that I had ongoing contact with churches in Oakland, Washington, D.C., and Nashville. And whenever they became fully inclusive, not just having an HIV ministry on the side, but when they became fully inclusive, they always lost members. And remember, part of the problem was they never had good, progressive, biblically based resources to begin with. So I wrote this book to meet that need, and I think it does do that. And I think one of the pros of the book is that I was able to work with Audre Lorde's concept of the mythical norm, which is white, male, heterosexual, and privileged, and show how all of these other groups are disadvantaged by that, because that becomes the Christian perspective. That becomes actually the American perspective, and everyone else gets constructed as other. So I had hoped that this book would be a resource for churches struggling with the issue of homosexuality, but it also discusses women, it also discusses people of color. I mean, it's broader than that, but it does include that. And I think on the whole, it's kind of been a failure, because I mean, my own denomination is struggling with the issue and they're not using it. But I think it ended up being more academic than I really would have liked, so that seminary students, people who have some background with more academic resources can use it. But I wanted it to be something that would be used in churches. In fact, I wrote the chapters. The chapters are short because I wanted to write it as a 6-week adult Bible study. That's what I really wanted it to be. And by and large, it hasn't been used that way. The other drawback is that nobody ever remembers the title. They always go, oh, Cheryl, that book of yours, you know, there's just something like that. And I thought it was all very clever, you know, ancient laws, contrasted with contemporary, and then and this is a Calder, a Mobile, and so it kind of looks like the scales of justice, but it's modern. I've even had people ask me, did you have to approve that image? Like, why is that image there? So nobody gets it. I got it, but nobody gets it. Nobody remembers the title. So I think on the whole, it hasn't done what I had hoped it would do. So what about my more recent work? Because this came out in 2009, and one of the things that happened after being in South Africa and doing work in the United States is that I got kind of discouraged, because it's like, come on, these rates are not really doing what they should be doing right now. People aren't getting tested. They aren't getting in treatment. They're not staying in treatment. So I need to go to some countries where they did a good job with prevention. So in more recent years, I've been to Cuba twice and Brazil 3 times, because those countries did a very good job with HIV prevention. And basically the reason why they did is that neither one took any money from the US. That's kind of the short answer, because by not taking money from the US, they never had to use that disastrous ABC program. And Brazilians, in my 3 times there, I've spoken to activists, and the first time I went, I would, working with a translator because they speak Portuguese, I said, oh, I'm so happy to be here, and I want to learn about the successful job in HIV prevention that you did here in Brazil. I've been doing work in the US and South Africa, and there we had to use ABC and it doesn't work. And they would go, ABC? So, again, through a translator, so I would say, A, abstain. And they would go, abstain? And so I would say, don't have sex. They would go, don't have sex? They just couldn't fathom that anyone would come up with anything so stupid. But at any rate, that was it. So, but both of them, in fact, Cuba has actually eliminated mother-to-child transmission, something that even the U.S. hasn't quite done. I mean, it's low, but Cuba was the first country to fully eradicate mother-to-child transmission. So those have been very helpful for me in my more recent years to get familiar with the context where they did a good job with prevention, and it gives me a model for what we could have done in the States if we hadn't been beholden to conservative evangelical policies. So my current work expands on this base. One of them that will come out, I think actually at the Society of Biblical Literature next month, and I look at sexual expression because I've seen so many things recently. We get into where when we talk about sexuality, we really mean homosexuality as if they're the only ones who have sex. So what I'm doing now is looking at sexual expression generally. And so I am looking at the Song of Songs, for instance, which is a text. There's a scholar by the name of Phyllis Tribble who says that love lyrics were lost in Genesis 2 and 3, and then they were redeemed in the Song of Songs, where there's a mutual, sensual relationship that is not hierarchical as described in Genesis 2 and 3. And so I use that in this article that will be in a volume on womanist biblical interpretation, and that'll soon be out. And then an article that I just found out this morning is due sooner than I thought it would be, is on neo-Pentecostalism and Methodism. And part of what I see in the more conservative trends in Methodism globally is that we're mimicking not only the worship style of neo-Pentecostalism, but also the theology, and that's deadly in the context of HIV. So that article is the 5th article on HIV that I desperately want to get out, so somehow I'm going to have to write it. When I thought I had until next summer, it's now due in March. So So I'll get that done. I wanted to just say something quickly about my methodology, because people often ask me, well, what's your methodology? And my methodology has been talking to people. So that it's not scientific, but I think in a way the value of that is that I have really been able to relate to people and understand their circumstances, their challenges, and it's given me incredible courage to talk about very difficult topics no matter where I am. I mentioned that I spoke at a conference just over the weekend, and I have a Twitter account, but I don't even really know what it is. I don't use it. But after I spoke, I was looking at the Twitter feed, and one of the comments was that, because there was a woman from South India who's an Anglican priest who spoke that Friday night. I spoke Saturday morning, and so the text was sent right after I spoke, and the person said, wow, I heard two women of color speak and they're both badass, you know, and I thought, whoa, I never thought I was badass before, but I think it comes out of the work that I've done, where I have been entrusted with people's stories, and it really does give me courage to talk about issues in ways that people may not ordinarily present them. And so I just wanted to give you quickly two examples of where talking with people actually triggered my research. And in this book, the very first paragraph describes a real incident. And so I'll read it. During the summer of 2005, I was teaching a Bible study class with teenagers who would be high school seniors that fall. I had them do an exercise, the purpose of which was to encourage them as people of faith to read the biblical text carefully and ask crucial questions about the messages communicated. We read the Ten Commandments, and I pointed out how slavery was condoned. And we read Judges 19, a particularly heinous story about the gang rape of a woman, and I showed them how one of the underlying messages of the text is that it would be better for a woman to be raped than a man. My goal was to get them to see that they already had a sense of who God is and how God is at work in the world that can help them evaluate problematic biblical texts. For one female African American student in the class, the exercise was a total failure. At one point, she had had enough, and she blurted out, "This is the word of God. If it says slavery is okay, slavery is okay. If it says rape is okay, rape is okay." So I was traumatized by that event. I went back to my room that afternoon and just sobbed, because it meant that in my own lifetime I had seen young people at the forefront of the civil rights movement in the 60s, and now I was seeing this young woman who was so beholden to the status quo that she couldn't see that her realities as a woman and as an African American would dictate that she read the Bible differently. So that's one example of where I've used this talking to people to trigger my research. The other one, and this is another article, as I said, I have 5 articles on HIV that are coming out in the next year or so, and one of them had to do with a pastor. Now, fortunately, I did not have this conversation with the pastor. Somebody told me about it. And you've got to remember that the context is South Africa, where a third of the adult population is positive, and young girls it's more likely for a schoolgirl in South Africa to be HIV positive than a prostitute in China. I mean, it's because of a lot of factors, but it means that young girls have a high HIV infection rate in South Africa. So the pastor was talking to a parishioner who happened to have been one of my faculty colleagues at UKZN, and she asked, "Are you teaching your son about condom use?" And he said, "No, I'm not teaching him about condom use. He knows that he should abstain until he gets married. And so she said, but what if he has sex and becomes HIV positive? And his response was, well, then he'll know that the wages of sin is death. It's a biblical verse, totally misinterpreted. But actually, my concern was not that it was a bad interpretation of the text. You got to read the whole passage and you'll see that it meant something quite different. But it was, how could any father say that about their own son? What kind of circumstances create that kind of separation between fathers? I mean, how can you be so beholden to a text if it's going to mean that? I mean, I just couldn't quite understand it. And so again, I have an article that will start off with that story. And what is it about African Americans and people of African descent? Because I even though that happened in South Africa, I have no doubt that there are some pastors who would say the same thing here. So what is it about us? What is it about that history of oppression that, I guess in a way it gets caught up in respectability, kind of politics. If we're respectable, if we abstain and all of this sort of stuff, then maybe white folks will like us. But we know that that really doesn't work. And you have to take into account that, especially a teenage boy, is human. And the stakes are too high for you to take a chance with his life. So my passion will continue. Unfortunately, my forecast is that HIV will once again become a very serious problem here in the United States for two reasons: the lack of health care, especially in the southern states where HIV infections are high, and the attack on Planned Parenthood that does the bulk of the testing. So you put those two together, and in 10 years we're going to have a problem, and we're all going to say, didn't we, take care of this? But the fact of the matter is we didn't. So anyway, that's my story, and we have some time for questions, responses.
I heard you correctly when you said that churches that had kind of more conservative biblical approach to studying scripture and then became fully open and inclusive lost members. Has anybody done work on progressive churches that are, like I pastored a church in Minnesota for 7 years, and we had a very progressive biblical studies. We became reconciling during that time, and the church grew by leaps and bounds. It was the fastest growing church in Minnesota, United Methodist, and still is in that same way. So I'm curious if anybody's looked at the kind of the flip side of that.
Right. Yeah, that would be interesting, and especially to see if you could trace that with some black churches. Now, I do know of one that would be an example of that, and I assume that they grew, and I can't think of his name now, but he's a pastor of a Baptist church in the Baltimore area, and I met him and heard him speak because he was a part of the effort for marriage equality here in Illinois, so he came to speak to us. And he said that when he made it known that he supported marriage equality in Maryland, that the overwhelming response of his congregation was positive.
How did he approach the Bible? I mean, I'm just curious.
I don't know. That's a good question. That was never one of my research churches, so I don't know how they did it. I know the Presbyterian Church had some really good resources, and my advice is don't spring it on people. I mean, do the work, and that's what you're describing, or you did, because there are good resources that are available. Yeah, but now they're available. They weren't necessarily 5-10 years ago. But yeah, that would be an interesting study to see if they grow. Otherwise,
why is HIV more prevalent?
That's a good question. I think that it does have to do with some inequalities that increase vulnerability. I do think that's true. But I also know that people of African descent, no matter where we are overwhelmingly Christian. And we're overwhelmingly conservative evangelical Christians. And it's the kind of thing where you get a pastor who says something like that. So it increases stigma. It means that you don't get the kind of community support you need to stay on medications. So I think it's a number of things. But my responsibility as a biblical scholar is to show them that they don't have to return to God. That's what I'm about. But it's a hard sell because they've never heard it that way. I know, speaking to African delegates in the United Methodist Church, you mean the missionaries were wrong? Like, yeah. But I mean, it's a difficult topic because it's like, we've always heard that this is wrong. And you people came here and told us that what we did, polygamy, was wrong, and now you're trying to shove something that we think is wrong down our throats. And so it makes for a real mess. Colleague, yes.
It's so good to hear you describe these different phases of your journey. And I was thinking that the first conversation you and I had was about that book.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
when it was
that's
before
right.
I came to Garrett.
That's right.
And it was about biblical interpretation.
Right.
And I don't know, I think we already knew we were on the same wavelength before we met.
Right.
But it was great. And I was struck in some of your stories are so moving and painful. And the one story that's sticking in my mind is the young woman who blew up in the Bible study because this is the Word of God. And I had a student like that in one of my classes. He was white, but he came out of the same framework. He said, we were like Philemon, he said, if slavery is approved in the Bible, then we have to accept it. He was a very gentle, passive person. He was just saying that what he thought about how you have to relate to the Bible. And of course, the class was horrified. But your response was so interesting to that young woman when you said, don't you already enter the class? Don't you already have things you know that can help you evaluate these stories? And what sprung to my mind was I was at a conference this last week where Margaret Mitchell from University of Chicago was talking about Origen's Psalm commentary. Origen was an ancient person of color, right? And some of his lost psalms have recently been found. By recently, I mean within the last decade. A whole group of lost psalms. She was giving a lecture on these, and in the psalm he was commenting on, he makes a comment that he makes in other places. He says, he's looking at problems in the text. Texts have text critical variants. And so you can't assume that the biblical text you're looking at is the original, because there's going to be human error in the copyists. It's a very high view of scripture, so it doesn't really say that maybe the authors have problems, but he's talking about the copies you have. And he says, yes, we come to the Bible last. He says, our faith doesn't rest in the Bible. He says, you first know about God through creation. He says this very explicitly. And then he says, you know about God from God's work in the churches. And maybe we could translate to that God's work in the world and experience, right? And he said, and then you come to Scripture, because the first two are more reliable. Now, he has a very high view of Scripture, but even with that high view of Scripture, he can say that about the order, hermeneutical order of knowing God. And so what you said struck me as very much in that, in the same orbit of how you know and what framework you bring to the Bible. Because things you already know.
You have to, you have a sense of who God is. And does this really sound as if it's of God? But that interesting, that the idea of authority of Scripture is really interesting, because the conference that I attended over the weekend is actually a group of conservative evangelicals who are biblically affirming inclusion. So they're doing some work that liberals and progressives haven't quite done in the same way, because they have a very high view of biblical authority. And when the organizer met me, he read the book and loved it and wanted me to speak at this conference. And so
when we met, I said, well, I see my ministry as giving progressives and liberals a biblical basis for what they do. And I said, so your community isn't really a community that I work with for the most part. But he said, you also have a high view of biblical authority. And I never thought of it that way. And I think that's where a number of people have said, you take the Bible seriously, you're assuming biblical authority. It's just, let's make it so that it doesn't hurt people. But I guess that's to be contrasted with Jesus Seminar and things like that, where you're actually trying to take away from, it's viewed by some as taking away from the authority of the Bible. Well, Jesus didn't really say that. So it's just interesting that this book has reached a different community. I took 20 copies of the book with me, and by the time I finished speaking, all 20 were sold. I really could have taken more, but I just, again, not really knowing the terrain. Yeah, I mean, that's something for us to really think about as a message, a more inclusive, less hurtful message has to be communicated. How do we do that so that people don't feel that their concept of the Bible is taken? I say that you have to redefine it, because if your sense of authority is only what that sliver of humanity has told you it is, then you've got a problem. Because I, as a black woman, say, I'm not going to submit to that kind of authority. I'm going to participate in it. I'm going to struggle with it. I'm going to have a different way of envisioning what authority is, but I'm not submitting to that. But that's a hard sell. Submitting to it.
So Dr. Anderson, thank you for your courage and your story. So I really appreciate it.
Oh.
Yeah, the journey.
Yeah, as I said, it's not often that I get to talk about the journey. So in fact, this is kind of a bookend, because the other side will be my sabbatical lecture. I was on sabbatical in the spring, and as a faculty member, you have to talk about what you did. It's like what I did over the summer. And so in March, I have to give that lecture. So now I've got to think of something different to say. So that'll be the other part of this.
Just one brief question.
They're all fun things that are very less required.
Well, it's just, in the beginning, you said your research was like out of your presentation about the people issues. So I'm sure as an experienced researcher, you encounter some challenges and barriers on your research and scholarship. So what kind of helps you to stay with your impression?
Well, one of the things that's been a big issue has been funding. Funding for HIV work generally has decreased because people think we've solved the problem. So that's been difficult. And another reason why funding is difficult is that funders now want to have a measurable outcome. And as I mentioned, my methodology is talking to people. I just spend a lot of time talking to people. And I love it. But I can't show a measurable outcome. But my writings come directly out of those encounters. So I would say that that's been the biggest one, especially now that I want to go to Brazil. I was able to go back to South Africa this summer because the International AIDS Conference was in Durban this July, so I went back for that. But the airfare alone, even at its cheapest, is $1,500. So that's the problem, continuing it. And also going to these churches. One of the things that I did when I had the various stages, when I went to various churches, I haven't gone back to share with them the more recent work, and I would like to do that. So yeah, so and beginning to find a way to get the message out more broadly. In fact, there was one African American woman at the conference this weekend, and she said, "You're a biblical scholar. Why haven't I heard of you?" And I said, "Well, I think part of the problem is that I'm not on Twitter." And she said, "Why aren't you?" You know, I mean, she wouldn't let me off the hook. You know, if you exist, why don't I know about you? And she named, in fact, I heard her speak. I went to her workshop, and she, of course, named some of the scholars I know. But it's part of it is learning how to get the message out there to a broader. All right, well, thank you very much.